Hey guys, Kyle, the Death Knight of Anime here, bringing you my review for One Piece chapter 965, and we have quite a bit to talk about with this chapter. Okay, so the first major thing to talk about with this chapter is a passing line from Neko Mamushi about when he's reading the newspaper and how he comments how there's never any news about Wano in the newspaper. And that one line alone immediately shows us the severe problem with this whole situation, with Oden being away from Wano and all of that. Because of Wano's seclusion from the rest of the world, Oden is, as of right now, completely unaware of what's happened to his father, and about Orochi taking temporary leadership of Wano. So, because of that, it really begs the question of what's going to be the inciting incident or trigger that causes Oden to learn of what's happening and return to Wano, or just in general how he ends up going from basically like traveling across the world to basically returning to Wano. Like, there has with the whole thing of basically Wano right now being in this situation of basically keeping every single bit of news like pretty much secluded from the rest of the world. Oden just doesn't know what's going on. So just the question of what's going to be of how he's going to learn of what's happened and what the inciting incident is going to be that's going to cause that is definitely going to be like one of the big questions that I think needs to be answered in at least in the next couple chapters for sure, or something like that. Cause yeah, that's actually the other thing we learn of the Prince Kurozumi family history in this chapter, and just how the whole history of Orochi's family and how it's explained is not only eerie in how much how much history was basically repeating itself throughout the events happening in this chapter, but throughout the chapter and revisiting all of what Orochi had done in context of the flashback, it not only shows us he more or less succeeded where his grandfather failed, but by revisiting his actions thus far, again within this flashback, it gives us the context of how, even though we knew from the very beginning of his introduction that it was all an act and everything he's been doing has been in order to secure his position within within the ranks of the shogun and the Kozuki clan. It shows us how he was able to manipulate the situation in order to gain the influence and power needed in order to eventually take control of Wano. Now, I will admit, the whole setup with who I can assume is Orochi's grandma felt a little too narratively on the nose from Doflamingo's backstory, structure-wise. Just in that little bit with basically his grandma explaining the legacy of the legacy of and the history of the Kozuki family and the Prince Kurozumi and the Kurozumi family, like just him explaining all that history, it all felt a little too similar to Doflamingo's backstory, but at least on a structural level. But but one curious detail we learned there is that she was the original holder of the clone fruit. So it's one of those things where it's not something you pretty much want to learn, but it gives you weird context that you can imagine after she died, Mr. Two got the power some point after. So it's kind of one of those weird connections you don't really think about, but Oda still decided to kind of in order to answer that question. Now, getting back to Oden for a moment, one thing we learned that's not surprising but still an interesting detail is that Momonosuke and Hiyori were both born during Odin's adventures with Whitebeard. And going back to what I said about Wano's seclusion from the rest of the world, it works both ways. Like, as it stands, Odin has no idea what's going on back in Wano, whereas right now, with pretty much Wano and specifically Orochi, he has, as of right now, Orochi has power, but because he's unaware of Odin's actions, once Odin returns with Toki as his wife and Momonosuke and Hiyori his children, that's when Orochi's greatest fear of history repeating itself will have come to pass. Because the other things this chapter does is that in terms of present day Wano, it basically it shows a lot more into what exactly Orochi's greatest fear is, because Orochi's greatest fear at this point is less the legend of the Red Scabbards, or even just is less like the Red Scabbards and more the legacy of failure that his family represents. And the moment Odin, and in terms of this flashback, the moment Odin steps foot back on Wano, the firm's trifecta of history, so to speak, will have come full circle, which is probably what inevitably is going to push Orochi in order to ally with Kaido. Like, it really is kind of one of those intriguing things how obviously when you really look at what's going on in this chapter, obviously the events are happening in a much different way compared to how pretty much Orochi's grandmother, I think she's his grandmother, had described it. But at the same time, even though the events themselves are different, the pretty much context of the events very much are kind of following a very similar narrative to what happened when On's father was born. Back then, the Shogun, he couldn't have children, but when Sakiaki was born, suddenly, like, pretty much that's what caused that's where everything went wrong for the. That's when everything went wrong for Orochi's family and whatnot. So, yeah, it's definitely going to be. So yeah, it is interesting to see how even though the events are different, the overall history in itself is still kind of repeating itself in terms of Orochi. For Orochi and whatnot. Another peculiar detail we get from this chapter is that we see Blackbeard when he first joins the crew. And one thing I'm definitely curious about there is that I believe in passing, Blackbeard had said the whole reason he joined Whitebeard's crew was in order to find the dark fruit. So I don't know if we're going to get it, but I'll be curious to know if even back then, in this moment in time, that when he was still just a child, that Blackbeard still had that goal, or if it was a goal that he attained when he was older. Because if it's the former, then this means, just like in the same way that Orochi had basically manipulated the whole situation in order to gain control of Wano. Blackbeard, like, from the very moment he was a kid, is going to be manipulating this same situation with is already starting to manipulate this situation with Whitebeard. Like, it's setting, like, Whitebeard's introduction is setting those events into motion already as well. And the chapter ends with a pretty much page spread of the Roger Pirates, and the most intriguing thing there is they mention Whitebeard offhand in the sense where they've already crossed paths. So if that is the case, I'm weirdly a little torn, because I guess it would make more sense that the Roger Pirates and the Whitebeard Pirates would have been rivals even before Odin. But considering how much Odin's how much Odin's acted as connective tissue for a lot of the adventures revolving around Whitebeard. I thought he would play a part in that as well, but it still works. It still works and whatnot. It still works. Like I'm not gonna complain if basically if the whole you're not gonna hear me complain either if the whole thing with basically Roger and Whitebeard happened even before Odin. Like, it's just one of those things where Odin has already been in such like Odin's adventures with Whitebeard has already sort of such connective tissue that I think it was a little weird in order to see that that's probably the one thing that he didn't help that wasn't connected to him in some way, I guess. But it's still it's still fine. Don't worry about it. Having said that. Um, if I'm getting the timeline of this chapter right, then how Odin meets Roger for the first time is guaranteed to be fucking hilarious. Because much earlier in the chapter, I'd say like page 5 or something, we pretty much see Odin going to scout the island on his own. And by the end of the chapter, Crocus brings up Whitebeard being docked on the same island as them, obviously. Uh, like, it has to be a situation where Odin's gonna pull, where Odin in probably his usual bombastic fashion is gonna come across Roger and his crew, and he's just going to just do the same shit he did when he encountered Whitebeard for the first time. He's gonna pull that same crap of trying to fight Roger, and with that, like, or I will say with that whole setup, we are starting to see like I guess the setup of the in between events. Like this is setting up a bit of an in between event of how Odin transitions from being on Whitebeard's crew to Roger's. Is like that in itself is definitely what this is leading to for sure. But it's just. Yeah, I'm curious to see how the events themselves are going to transpire because, yeah, Odin's gonna pick another fight. Like, it's, like I don't know, maybe it's just me, but I don't know, maybe it's just me, but to me, Odin picks more fights than Luffy. Like, weirdly enough, like I just in this whole thing. I've discovered how that Odin might actually like picking more fights than Luffy does. Weird to say, but yeah, or maybe they're about the same. I don't know, but yeah, Odin just he's basically just bombastic enough to do that. You know he is, but yeah, but yeah, guys, that's all I got for this review. If you enjoyed the video, like, comment, subscribe. Follow me on Twitter, Facebook, AniList, or Crunchyroll. Death Knight of Anime signing off. Later, guys.